Greetings ladies and gentlefish, and welcome to another tank review. This time we are looking at the Tier 8 Soviet tank destroyer. This is the SU-101. This is on the tank destroyer line that, maybe about a year ago now, was revamped and changed, and now, it used to lead up to the Object 263, now leads through the Object 263 to the Object 268 version for the Bobject. So just before we get too much further, again, I like to start these off with a little bit of history, so I just thought I'd give you that. Essentially, there were some other designs that went along around about the same time as the SU-100. Now, the SU-100 was brought into the Soviet Army in World War II in 1943, 44, something like that. But there were problems with it. I mean, it was generally considered satisfactory, but flawed. So things like, for example, the rear-mounted engine was considered a problem. Now, if you're playing this game, you may think, what? But frontal engines mean you take engine damage, it will knock your engine out. Well, you have to bear in mind that if you have the engine at the front of the tank, then if a shot goes into the machine and hits the engine and gets stopped by the engine, that's less chance that it will hit the crew, that it will hit the ammo rack, that you'll get considerable spalling inside the vehicle. And also, if you have the engine at the front, then that means you can literally put a door in the back of the tank so that if it gets knocked out, the crew can get out whilst minimising their exposure to enemy fire. So there is actually some logic there. But the Red Army weren't particularly happy with the rear-mounted engine. The tank was also quite cumbersome. I mean, you've got the length of a T-34, and then you have a 100mm gun poking out the front. I mean, I've got one, we can just have a quick look. I mean, look how much this gun pokes out the front of the tank. I know in game, the gun doesn't collide with anything, doesn't have a collision model, but can you imagine trying to navigate the streets of Stalingrad with that thing poking out the front? It's just awkward. And also, as you can probably see, the machine was quite front heavy, which meant there was quite a lot of weight placed on the front drive wheels, which meant they were kind of prone to mechanical failure. So, whilst this machine was satisfactory, the Red Army weren't overly enamoured with it, and so there were some alternative designs put forward. A couple of them were basically just the SU-100 with some modifications, like a bigger gun, yeah, because that's going to fix your weight distribution problems, or with an electric transmission, which always goes well during the Second World War. But there were a few that were slightly more interesting. So the other three were based, or the others, some of the others were based on the chassis of the T-44. So if you ignore the machines that are literally just a straight up conversion of the old SU-100, you had the SU-101 M1, sorry, SU-100 M1, my apologies, which was, it had a rear fighting compartment, it was based on the chassis of the T-34, and we have it in game at Tier 7 on this same tech line. You then had the SU-100 M2, basically the same tank, but, or the same concept, but based on the chassis of the T-44 medium tank. And that's what we have here. You then have the SU-122-44, which was again based on the chassis of the T-44, but was given a frontal fighting compartment rather than a rear fighting compartment, had a 122mm gun, and was generally just considered a bit too unwieldy to really be useful. And again, we have this in the game at Tier 7, but we're not going to spend this video looking at it. The machine that was ultimately chosen was the SU-100M2, so chassis of a T-44, rear fighting compartment, and a 100mm gun. This is basically what we have in the game here in the form of the SU-101. Now, there were three different machines built. One had a 100mm gun, one had a 122mm gun, and one was just an empty hull for armour testing. And these things were, despite some problems, you know, there are problems with having a rear fighting compartment, terrible gun depression for example. This thing was quite cramped, it used to overheat, there were some structural issues. Despite all that, this thing was actually recommended for mass production. That was only really stopped when the World War II inconveniently came to an end, and thus there was no need to build this thing anymore. But this thing did exist, and there are copies of this thing that do exist to this day as far as I am aware. So, enough waffle about the history. What is it that we get in game? Well, this thing is a Tier 8 tank destroyer. Now, if you played this before they revamped this tank destroyer line, you'll be used to this line being reasonably armoured from the front, but not exceptional. It wasn't the sort of armour you could rely on. But being quite mobile and having sort of medium gun style, well, medium tank, sorry, guns mounted to them. Since the revamp, that's changed a bit. They slashed the mobility of these things, buffed the armour, and gave them guns that tended to be larger in calibre. Not very accurate, but snapshot fairly well. So, this is where we come to the SU-101 in-game. What is it that we've got to look forward to? I'll come on to the gun in just a moment. Survivability, this thing has 40mm of armour at the rear, 90 on the side and 150 on the front. Now, some of you may be looking at that and going, well, if it's based on the chassis of a T-44, should it not share the 90mm of frontal hull armour of the T-44? And yes, it should. Historically, this thing had 90mm of hull armour. When this was first introduced to the game, it had 90mm of frontal hull armour. Wargaming have artificially buffed it. Go figure. 1100 hit points, which is not bad. It's more than it used to have, but, I mean, it's still a Tier 8 tank destroyer. Unless you're something like a Ferdinand or a Jagdtiger 88 or an AT-15, you tend to have not much more than 1000 hit points, so that's not a huge amount of hit points to go around. As I mentioned, the mobility of this tank was slashed, so don't let that 17.5 horsepower per ton fool you. Whilst this thing can get up to its top speed of 54 kilometers an hour when going downhill, if you're turning, if you're just accelerating, you should not be expecting to get to those top speeds. And the traverse speed of this thing was quite badly hit. So what you find is that this thing, whilst it's not slow, it just feels a little sluggish, especially if you were used to playing this thing a couple of years ago before they made any significant changes to it. Concealment is pretty good. It's a tank destroyer. It's a fairly low profile tank destroyer. That's basically what you would expect. Spotting, well, you have a 350 meter base view range at Tier 8, which is pretty woeful. So if you want to increase that view range, I would strongly recommend binocular telescopes. We'll get onto equipment in a moment, but that would be my recommendation. We'll have a quick look at the grind, then we're going to talk about the gun. So, the grind on this tank, well, okay, obviously the suspension is going to be unique to this tank. You don't get suspension on other vehicles. The top engine, if you have played the T-44 or the T-54, you'll already have unlocked. If you've only ground through this tank destroyer line, or if you've not previously played those two vehicles, this will be a new module for you. 560 horsepower up to 620, and you lose a little bit of weight as well. It is a worthwhile upgrade. I would definitely recommend it. Would it be your priority? Well, we'll get to that in a moment. The radio is used on a variety of different machines, but generally speaking only Tier 7 or Tier 8 and upwards, depending on which lines you have played. And interestingly, you do not find this radio on the SU-101 at Tier 7. So again, if you're only playing up this line, you're going to have to unlock that radio. Stock gun on this tank is awful. You do not want to be using it if you can possibly get away with it. The problem is that, well, this is the gun you will have from the SU-101. Yeah, you're not going to have any of the other guns necessarily unlocked. I mean, this one is unique to this tank. Then you have this gun, which is unique to this tank. Can you see a pattern forming here? And then the top gun, which is technically not unique to this tank, but the other machine it's used on is the Tier 9. So yeah, this is where you're going to be spending a lot of your grind, cussing and swearing, and this is where, if you've got some free XP lying around, this is where you're going to want to burn it. I would recommend, as a bare minimum, you want this 100mm gun, the D54S. It's 19.5 or 19,400, I guess, experience, so 19,500 experience. If you want to drop some free XP, that's not a terrible idea. You are going to need to go through all these guns anyway. And actually, if you compare this gun with the replacement for it, so to speak, then you get a decrease in rate of fire. I mean, you're going from a 100 to a 122mm gun, so fair enough. Your penetration goes down, your premium penetration goes down, your alpha damage goes up, your accuracy gets worse, your aim time gets worse. My recommendation would be, drop some free experience on this 100mm gun, because the 122 that you have to unlock is 46,000 XP. I would not free XP that gun, because you could argue, you may not even want to use it, you could argue it's a pretty marginal upgrade anyway. Oh, technically the DPM is also slightly lower. So I would just grind that gun out conventionally. Once you've ground that gun out, you could either grind the top gun out, or that's where you might want to drop some free XP again, because this is a significant upgrade over either of these guns. So let's say, for example, you decided to use this 122mm gun. Let's just compare it with the Top Gun. Top Gun gets a lower rate of fire, but higher DPM, more on that in a moment. Higher penetration, higher alpha damage, better accuracy, and the same aim times. So, yeah, you want to use this gun. This is the money maker. Well, metaphorically speaking. And then you can unlock the Object 263. So I would prioritise the guns, then you can worry about the engine, then you can get the 263. That would be my recommendation for the grind. Speaking of guns, we've already had a look at a couple of them and pointed out why they're maybe not great. Let's have a look at the actual Top Gun on this tank. It's a 122mm gun, which is nice because there are some 40mm armour plates in the game that you will therefore be able to overmatch. 4.76 rounds per minute rate of fire, giving this thing a kind of dodgy DPM of only just over 2000, or 2100, something around about there. It's not the best. I mean, this is showing 2400, but please bear in mind that is with vents and a gun rammer. If you strip away the roughly 300-ish DPM you get from having those two, you're down to around 2200 DPM. For a tier 8 tank destroyer, that's not great. There are tier 7 tank destroyers with much higher DPM. 258 penetration with your standard armor piercing rounds is nice, 340 with your premium rounds. 440 alpha is also perfectly nice at tier 8. Decent high explosive rounds. The fully aimed accuracy, the dispersion, is garbage. The aim time of 2.5 seconds is not terrible, but it's not great. Decent soft stats on this gun, but a very narrow gun traverse, meaning that you have to re-aim an awful lot, and the gun depression is woeful at 3 degrees, so you can't be relying on that at all. This is essentially the gun from the IS-4 chucked on a tier 8 TD. So, there is that. The gun is fine, but it's at its best when used up close and personal. Now, I'm going to show you two games, one where we are top tier and one where we are bottom tier. The top tier game, our gun is going to be used much more close range. The bottom tier game is going to be used at much longer range, because when you are bottom tier, your armor doesn't count for a huge amount, and you kind of have to take some shots from longer range, or you're going to get penetrated a lot. From closer range, then, when top tier, you can fight at closer range, and that's absolutely fine. So, crew skills, equipment, consumables, all of that jazz. I don't think there's going to be anything that comes as a massive surprise here. Equipment, gun rammer, yes. Vents, yes. Third equipment slot, you can't take vertical stabilizers because it's a tank destroyer. I would recommend against coated optics a base view range of 350 meters. Just means you're going to not get that much out of coated optics, so I use binos on mine just to buff the view range up a little bit. You could use a toolbox, but I think then you lack a little bit of flexibility. You could use an enhanced gun laying drive. Again, I think that eats into your flexibility a little bit, but they are options. Camo net, I really would not recommend it at all. Ammunition, you carry 28 rounds of ammo in this tank. I've got 2 HE, 6 heat and 20 AP. I used to take fewer heat rounds, but then I had to burn through it was a high tier Japanese heavy, I can't remember what it was. There aren't any usable weak spots on the front of those damn things, so had to heat it and I ran out of heat, and hence I take a few more rounds of it. Crew, Sixth Sense, repairs is your friend. This is really a tank where, if at all possible, you want to be in the thick of the fighting. You can take camouflage, as you can see I have taken here, but bear in mind I gave these guys camouflage before they changed this tank line. I've had the SU-101 for quite a while. Would I recommend camouflage these days? I wouldn't prioritise it. I would probably take Brothers in Arms first, but I'll leave that up to your discretion. Consumables, I've got your standard set of consumables. You take enough crew and module damage in this tank that you don't want to swap certainly the repair kit or the first aid kit out for something else. You could go with large versions of those if you are really worried about the chances of you chances of you losing crew and whatnot. Now that the small versions are reusable, you know, they're on a timer per match, That's my preference, but you know, your mileage may vary. I would not bother swapping out the manual fire extinguisher. I find that fire is a thing that can happen on this tank, so just be aware of that. I think that's quite enough of my waffle, so let's go and have a look at the armor profile and some gameplay. So perhaps unsurprisingly, from the front of this tank, shots will take out the driver and the engine. I mean, from the description, that really shouldn't surprise you too much. From the left-hand side of the vehicle, again, the engine is going to be a problem. The ammo rack is just below the superstructure, quite deep down in the hull. You might be able to damage the ammo rack from this side, of course, but it is not the easiest shot in the world. What's really interesting is that the ammo rack continues around the side of the vehicle. So from the rear, you can see that basically the right-hand side of the vehicle is ammo rack central. And from the right-hand side, of course, you've got the rear of the superstructure and down into the hull itself. So it's not uncommon for this tank to get ammo racked, unfortunately. And that's really worth noting. The other thing is it's quite a small tank with 4 crew members, so it's not uncommon for your crew to die. Basically, module damage and crew damage is relatively common in the SU-101. Here we are with the armour profile then. From the rear, not a huge surprise, 40mm, you can penetrate this with everything. Although 40mm is enough to mean that, you know, the typical high explosive shells you normally come across are probably not going to penetrate. From the side of this tank, it is 90mm of armour, but I mean, that does have some angling, and obviously you've got some tracks in the way, so you can get some bounces from the side, and you can actually side scrape in this thing, even if you're not really able to point your gun at the target at the same time. From the front, this Commander's cupola thing here is still around about 200mm thick, even if you hit it flat on. Lower front plate of this tank, flat on, is, well, it's around about, sort of, depending on the exact angle, 190, 200, depends on your engagement distance as well. It's around about that mark, which is not terrible, but you do get, I find you do get penetrated there quite a lot. And this feeds into something else I've noticed when playing this tank. I don't think I've ever played a tier 8 that attracts premium ammunition quite as much as this thing, which I find a little curious. But there we go. So bear that in mind when I talk about the armour. So lower front plate, effective thickness of around about the 190 to 200 mark. Now this does mean that there are a number of tanks, especially those with preferential matchmaking at tier 8, that have penetrations in the sort of 170 to 190 range that are going to struggle to penetrate this thing frontally, because the upper front plate is 200 to 210. The superstructure is around about 220, 230, and of course you've got some insane values on some areas of the gun mantler. So to penetrate this thing frontally, realistically, you need around about 200-ish millimeters of penetration if you're going to go for the lower front plate. If you're closer and you're shooting down on the thing, yeah, then you're probably better off shooting at the upper hull. Now this little vision port is quite interesting. It is modelled as a hitbox, and it is only 130mm thick. So if you are struggling to penetrate this tank, then you could switch to trying to shoot it in this, just wait for the model to load up, trying to shoot it in this vision port here, because it should do damage. This is not something I've really noticed people taking advantage of, but it looks like it has a hitbox, so it should do hit point damage to the vehicle. Which means that, for those people who don't know the weak spot, which as far as I can work out is pretty much everyone, for those people who don't know the weak spot, then they're going to be looking at 200mm of penetration to pen you, and what I find is people just dab the 2 key and put premium straight through the front of your tank. If you know what you're doing, you can penetrate the front of this thing, certainly from close range. I mean, this would be harder to hit from longer range, but certainly from close range you can penetrate the front of this thing in a tier 6 medium tank most of the time. So yeah, there's that. You can angle your armour, of course, in this machine. You can get up to, well, that's getting sort of around about 200 to 220. Ooh, yeah, on all faces. Right, but you have to angle this at an auto bounce angle, otherwise your side is just not thick enough to really do much. So the best armour you're going to get out of this thing is around about 220mm. Bearing in mind, if you do this, because the gun traverse is so narrow, you can't actually point your gun at the target. The gun depression is also woeful. If you want to make the best use of your armour, often what you want to be doing is trying to hide your hull and only expose your superstructure, but the really dodgy gun depression on this tank makes that quite awkward to do. I mean, your gun depression allows for that. Yeah, good luck. So you end up trying to find terrain on the flat that hides your hull, like a pile of rubble or something along those lines. Now, interestingly, when playing this tank, I certainly did not feel that the armour was ridiculously good. It is very pennable, and lots of people penned it all the time, although again, I ate a lot of premium ammunition while playing this thing. Make of that what you will. Having said that, the armour does appear really to just be flat out better than tanks that seem kinda similar, like the Ferdinand. Now, I don't want to get into a direct comparison between this and the Ferdinand, but it's just interesting to note that as the Ferdinand is on the Tiger P's hull, the Tiger P's hull is a bit bigger, has more weak spots, the weak spots are weaker, and the superstructure of the Ferdinand is 200mm thick, and pretty much flat as a pancake, whereas on this thing you're looking at about 220 to 230 effective. So, it's just an interesting thing to note. Anyway, let's show you some gameplay. Here we go with the first game then, and this is of course top tier. So this is a tier 8 match, 357 matchmaking, and we are one of the tier 8s here on the steps. No, cliff map. Oh, I get the names muddled up. And I'm going to use the machine as an assault tank destroyer, which kind of makes sense. We're top tier. One of the nice things about the SU-101 is it gets usable armour. Not amazing armour, not idiot-proof armour, but, you know, usable. So, if you're on this map and you want to kind of be a bit more aggressive in an assault-style tank, well, there's only really about one place you can be, especially if you don't have a turret, and that's over here on the 9 lines. The 1 and 2 lines you can't really push down. You'll just get tank destroyed and artilleried into the next week. And kind of the middle region of the map is much more light tank, medium tank territory, and you can see that AMX-12T actually gets himself deleted, poor guy. So instead we are going to come around here to the 9 line, and one enemy tank has already died and another one has managed to overturn their vehicle, so one of their top tiers is already gone, which is nice. It would be interesting to see what the enemy team's chat was like at the moment. So, oh hello Mr. Panther, he bounces on me and I completely miss him. This is the gun for you. It does generally snapshot fairly well, but the actual dispersion, the accuracy of the gun is pretty woeful. So you shouldn't be surprised if and when you miss a variety of shots, unfortunately. That's the way it is. And the armour, whilst the armour is not bad, it's not so good that you want to just sit out there in front of people and let them aim at weaker spots. So we managed to put one shot into that Panther, rolling slightly high, 463, and you can see that 440 alpha damage with not a bad reload is actually really tasty to have on a tier 8 machine, 457 that time. And the IS-6 goes into my tracks. Now the IS-6 is going to struggle to penetrate me frontally unless he double taps 2 and loads that APCR ammunition. He doesn't get heat. And we put another one into him for 433, a slightly low roll. The Panther, however, I just want to highlight this, the Panther has just shy of 200mm of penetration. And you can't really actually see it here, but I believe the Panther shot me in the lower front plate, and he's going to do that repeatedly. So you're not sort of immune to those lower tier tanks. And the Panther, to be fair, does have relatively high penetration for a tier 7 medium tank, and we bounce that shot. But even so, 200 penetration is common enough at tier 7. And you even find it a bit at tier 6, that, yeah, you are not sort of immune to these guys. Trying to get that shot into the IS-6's lower front plate, but instead it just blows the guy's track off, which is a little unfortunate. Coming around, see if I can pick up the kill this time, and there we go. IS-6 is dead, and I'm pretty sure I took all the hit points of that IS-6 away. I don't think anyone else contributed at any point to his demise, though I could be wrong. So we've managed to get ourselves a kill, around about 2,000 damage, which is nice. But now we get into the slightly more awkward phase of the game, shall we say. Hello, Mr. Oh, where did that go? T-3485M. So this would involve us coming out from around the side of this sort of hill area. And I was expecting that T-3485M to sort of jink to the side, and unfortunately he didn't. But we are able afterwards to pick up a kill on that Panther. And we're up to 2.4k damage. Coming around, but no. T-3485M has decided he doesn't really want it, and I'm being a little cautious here because they have 3 tank destroyers on the enemy team, and I'm expecting at least one of them to be roughly where that Scorpion has been spotted. And I don't want those guys to get free shots into the side of my vehicle. And this game is going to deteriorate very quickly for the enemy teams. There isn't actually that much of it left. And you could argue perhaps I should have been more aggressive here, but well, bitter experience has taught me that if you're too focused on cleaning up at the end of the game when you're winning, you can run the risk of losing because everyone else on your team is too focused on cleaning up and they don't actually engage their brain, and you don't engage your brain when actually trying to fight these guys. Scorpion G, can I get a shot on him? No, not really. Trying to see what we can do here. That Scorpion's just getting pretty wrecked. There's only 5 of them left at this point. I'm going to take a shot on that WZ that's not fully aimed. I don't know if I have a shot, but I thought it was worth a punt. And again, I'm just being really cautious here. I don't want that Scorpion to shoot me in the side, but as it turns out, Panther 88 nails him and he is dead. Oh, hello, Mr. M6, and boom, headshot. 427 to kill that guy. WZ131 GFT takes my track out. And, ooh, then bounces off my superstructure. I think it's my superstructure. Going for a shot there, but nah, that was very unlikely to actually connect. Can I pick up the kill? No, Panther 88's all over that. And that just leaves the Jagdpanther and the SU-8 artillery piece. And this tank is, well, mobile-ish. It's not as mobile as it used to be, but mobile-ish. But we're just going to wait up here and see if... Oh no, we're not going to wait up here. Sorry, I'm getting confused with another game, clearly. We're going to go and see if we can pick up any kills on either of these fellows. Hitting sort of low 50s, going downhill, but, you know, once you are downhill and you try turning, don't be surprised, sorry, if and when that speed just bleeds away. Jagdpanther manages to take out the T-3485M, and I'm not able to get there quite in time to pick up the kill as the Panther 88 manages to do so instead. So, first game for you, went top tier, just to show you kind of a little bit of brawling in the tank, and where your armour is going to work and where your armour might encounter some problems. So that game ended up being enough for second class mastery, duelist, 5 for effect, and a high caliber medal. So none too shabby a result. 2,798 damage done, 3 kills, 966 base experience, puts me at the top of my team by, well, experience, but it would also be the top by damage and joint top by kills. So a pretty nice game for the SU overall. 12 shots fired, 8 hits, 7 penetrations, bearing in mind that a couple of those shots were very, very chancy, but I thought I'd go for it anyway. 9 hits received, 1 penetrated from that Panther, 8 did not for 835 damage blocked by our armour. 2 enemy vehicles spotted, 3 damaged, 3 destroyed, 523 assistance damage, and 2.28 kilometres travelled. With a premium account we made a profit of 34,000 credits. We still would have made a profit with the standard account. And you can see there the ammunition. I mean, given that it does 440 damage when it connects, the ammunition isn't too expensive. I mean, around about 1,000 credits per shell is what you expect to pay for a 122mm gun, and you get that price on many guns of that caliber with much lower penetration, so that's not too bad, I've found. Second game then, and we are of course bottom tier here on Lakeville. Lakeville, yes, I can remember names, promise. And at the beginning of this game I was having a quick look down the team roster for the enemies, and a couple of things spring to mind. I mean, this is 357 matchmaking, obviously it's a tier 10 match, so we are at the bottom of the feeding pool. But the thing with this gun is that it's not very accurate when fully aimed, so sniping with this gun is not generally recommended. So I'm considering the possibility of going into the town and brawling, essentially. So, like I said, having a look down the enemy team list, and there's nothing there that I look at and go, well, can't penetrate that. You know, there's no Type 4 or Type 5 heavies that Wargaming implemented with no meaningful weak spots, because reasons. Yeah, reasons indeed. So, I mean, I can damage all of those guys, even though I am bottom tier. So, that's nice. The T124, whoa, pro driving there. The T124 is clearly the biggest threat that is likely to be turning up to the town. Doesn't mean he will turn up into the town, it depends obviously on the driver, but I would not be surprised to see him there. That big 155mm gun capable of doing quite a lot of hurt. So, we're not rushing completely forwards because I have fallen foul of that in this tank before. You rush forward into a position and suddenly realise you're the only one there and it's a tier 10 match and you're a tier 8 machine. Which, given that this thing isn't actually that fast, unless you're going downhill, is kind of impressive, but never mind. But we've got plenty of our team who have pushed forward, so let's push forward and give them a hand. You'll also notice that both the Centurion 7 and the E75 have been spotted over in the valley, so we're not going to have to worry about those guys, but conversely, for example, our Jagdpanzer E100 is also in the valley, so we're not going to have him supporting us, which, well, that's a shame, but never mind. T32, T10, 110, T44, 100, and of course there's a tank destroyer over on the valley road. So, what are we going to do? Well, I don't want to just push into the T32 and the T10, because that's looking like a little bit of a crowded place to go, and I don't really like crowded. Instead, wow, pro driving again, instead I'm going to see if I can get any shots onto these fellas who are over on the sort of tank destroyer road. Now I do have to be a little careful with this, and again, this gun is not particularly suited to long range combat, but we're going to give this a punt anyway. There we go, we managed to shave off, like, whoa, 44% of that WZ's health. Looks like he's still going to be there, so we'll try a blind shot. Looks like that shot connected, whether it penetrated or not. Yeah, that looks like a penetration. And that WZ is now clearly having quite a bad day. Can we pick up the kill on this guy? There we go. So, despite the gun's dubious accuracy, it worked on that occasion, and we've managed to pick up all of the hit points on that tier 8 tank destroyer. So we've already pulled our weight. One tier 8 tank destroyer executes another. Have a shot there on the rear of the Somua SM, and we managed to put 455 damage into his backside before he backs off. Now, on the one hand, I mean, we've kind of won the town, sort of, as in we've pushed through the town. The problem is, ooh, this is a chancy shot. Ooh, got a bit lucky there. The problem is that the scoreline is 5-8, now 6-8. Now, their Object 140 appears to be AFK, but even so, the scoreline is not looking particularly healthy. No, he's not AFK, he did move. But either way, I can't sit there trying to shoot the 140 all day. I really need to give my ST1 and Super Pershing a hand against this AMX 13105, whilst also bearing in mind the fact that our base is currently being capped, and oh, this is just icky. And essentially our team have just been too aggressive, pushed too far forwards, and it's all going to go hideously wrong. Now I decided to head back to base at this point, and try and just defend that against the inevitable push. We'll see how that goes. Centurion 7/1 has been spotted, and well, we're just going to do our best here. The scoreline's 7-9. It's not that this game is lost per se, but it is a little concerning that whilst we've kind of won the town, that ST1 who has decided to continue pushing through the town, I'm not convinced that that's the best plan in the world. Hello, Mr. E75. Managed to find a shot on him. 411 into that guy. Low damage roll, but I can't really complain after I did actually find the penetration. This is never going to penetrate the Centurion. Nah, don't even bother taking the shot. Again, I'm actually doing the long-range traditional tank destroyer-y thing because I'm very conscious that my armour is considerably less valuable, that one missed, when I am bottom tier, which is something to be aware of. And I'm trying to give support to my guys who are being aggressive and just going for it. T30 has been spotted, but I do not have viable shots onto him, although our T10 kills the Centurion 7, so this game has now been levelled up. And we've done just shy of 2,000 damage to the bad guys so far, so we've not had a bad result thus far, and we managed to sneak one there into the frontal plate on the T30, so we're up to 2.4k damage done. And what else can we do here? Oh, ST1 falls to the AMX-30 and 105. I can't say I'm colossally surprised, but it is what it is. And it looks like this T30 is not long for this world. Come on, can someone finish him off? Yeah, CDC manages to take him out. And the scoreline is once again evened up at 10-10. Now I'm slightly nervous about the AMX-13 105. He's a little concerning. Really don't want him pushing up into my backside. And I decide that really we need some people to be keeping a watch over the town. And there's the AMX-13 105, and there's the Object 140. I was not expecting him to be there. That's a bit unfortunate. His first shot goes into my tracks. His second shot doesn't. I put one shot into him to leave him a one shot. He's going to come around again. I managed to kill the Object 140, but unfortunately the AMX-13 105, yeah, takes me down. Bit of a shame, but there we go. So, managed to claim the Object 140, which is good. Died to the 13105, which is less good. And now our T10 is looking the wrong way as he runs straight into a T110E4 on full health, I might add. And the artillery finishes him off. And that just leaves an AMX CDC and a Scorpion. And they're spread over two different ends of the map. I mean, it probably doesn't take a genius to see the way in which the wind is blowing on this one. Once the AMX-13 105 is reloaded, I don't imagine the Scorpion is going to last long. Yeah, and voila. A loss, unfortunately. But nonetheless, we'll have a look at the post-game stats for this one and see if there's anything that we can draw out. So, yes, that was a defeat, which is a little bit unfortunate, but I think we had a reasonable impact on that game. We were able, towards the beginning, to just take out that Tier 8 tank destroyer on the enemy team in 3 shots. 440 alpha damage will allow you to do that pretty darn reliably, as Tier 8 tank destroyers rarely have more than about 1200 hit points. So that is quite a nice feature. We actually finished at the top of our team by experience and the top by damage. In fact, we actually finished at the top of the game by damage done, which I was a little surprised about, but, you know, we will run with it. So, what was the big difference between the two teams there? Well, if we have a quick look, for example, at the performance of our Tier 10s, there, AMX-13 105, almost 3k damage, 5 kills, but RT100 LT, 3k damage, 3 kills, so, you know, that's not too bad. What about the other two Tier 10s? Their T110E4, 2.3, 2.4k damage, nothing too spectacular, and their Object 140 did not have a very good game at all. But, despite that, our Yak Panzer E100 had a terrible game, going Valley for some inexplicable reason, and dying, having dealt 0 damage. And our Batchat 12T, he did about the same as the Object 140, so there was a disparity in terms of Tier 10s there, in that, basically, our worst performing Tier 10 was abysmal, our second best performing Tier 10 was about comparable with their worst performing, and so on and so forth. So, there was that to be aware of. If we have a look at the stats for me, 11 shots fired. Now the gun actually behaved itself relatively well that game, so 9 hits, 9 penetrations. I generally find it's not penetrating your target that's difficult with this gun, it's hitting it, especially if you're taking those shots at longer range. And this is really why the tank excels or is much better when top tier. When top tier, your armour means something. I mean, you can see there, I received 4 hits, 3 penetrated, 1 didn't. The shot that didn't penetrate went into my tracks, it didn't actually bounce. Oh no, I tell a lie, it did actually bounce. Haha, happens occasionally. So we did manage to bounce 1 shot, hurrah! But, you know, when people have a chance to properly engage you, it's not that difficult for them to penetrate you when you are bottom tier. Which shouldn't come as a huge surprise, but it means you end up trying to be more circumspect with how you deal damage, because you can't really rely on your armour, so you have to rely on camouflage and whatnot, and this gun really isn't suited to that. Nonetheless, we were able to do 3,500 damage. You can see that almost 3k from longer distance. We were able to pick up 2 kills, one of which was of course that tank destroyer, and we were also able to kill that Object 140. And the only targets you're really going to have difficulty penetrating with this gun are things like Type 4, Type 5 heavies, because reasons, and hull down tanks, which is fair enough. Now, I did actually have a game where I had to kill some Type 4 or Type 5 heavies, can't remember which, and that's why you may have noticed between these replays I changed the amount of premium ammunition I took. 3 rounds in this one. In the first game I showed you, which was actually played sometime later, I took 6 rounds for that reason, because sometimes you just need that penetration to punch through targets like that with no viable weak spots. But for most of the time, your penetration is enough. So we managed to damage 5 enemy tanks, killed 2 of them, just shy of 20,000 credit profit, even on a loss with a premium account, but without a premium account that still would have been a 5,500 credit profit. So, yeah, the tank is pretty decent at dealing out damage, I would say. So, what are my overall thoughts on this machine? It can be fun, and when it's in its element, which is basically top tier on flat terrain, getting to bully lower tier tanks, it can do quite well. However, the narrow gun traverse, the slightly dodgy gun in some circumstances, the terrible gun depression, these all make the tank quite inflexible, and that inflexibility can be a pain. This thing does not like being bottom tier at all, and when you are bottom tier you tend to try and hang back a little bit, which forces you into doing something the gun is not very good at, and anyway. I don't think this tank is overpowered. It's not another Bobject or anything. I don't think it's underpowered. I think it's fairly well placed in terms of balance. I was a little bit sad that they changed this line because I thought it offered something a bit different before, and now they've turned it into another assault tank destroyer line. Your mileage may vary, go figure. I am not keeping this thing. It just frustrates me sometimes, so I'll pick up the ace in it at some point. And once I've done that, I'll sell it and move the crew up to the Object 263, which kinda looks like a bit more of the same, but I guess I could be wrong. I mean, then that was kind of Wargaming's aim, right? To turn this whole lot into more of the same. Anyway, I'm not keeping it, but it's certainly not a hideously painful tank to play. The one thing I am very conscious of is because I did this grind a long time ago, I did not have this exact gun grind. This looks like it could potentially be quite annoying. I mean, I played the tank with this gun, but it was a better version of this gun, and the tank was more mobile, so yeah. Anyway, like I said, I'm not keeping it, but your mileage may vary. I hope you guys enjoyed that review or possibly found it vaguely informative. If you did, by all means feel free to catch some of my other videos and or subscribe to my channel. And as ever, I wish you very happy hunting on that battlefield. Ciao ciao.